Welcome, my name is Jeff Badenoch. I'm a volunteer with the Montana Book Festival, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session, which is Montana and the Muse. It's not surprising in a state like Montana where you can't swing a cat without hitting a writer or a bookseller or a book publisher, certainly readers, that we would have a panel that's centered around Montana as a muse. We have 3 authors with us today, and I'd like to introduce them all, and then we'll have them each do readings or talk about their work, and then we'll have a discussion among the authors, and of course we'll have an opportunity for audience to ask questions. So that's kind of the way the program's going to work today. First off, our first author is Rosella Mosteller. She is a photographer, and she's a sole proprietor of Mosteller Photos. Second, we're going to hear from Chris Warren. Chris is a resident of Cooke City, Montana, and he spent years researching Hemingway's connection to the area. In 2018, he presented a paper on Hemingway's final short story, which was set in Cooke City, to the Hemingway Society in Paris, France. Warren's research was instrumental in bringing the Society's biennial conference to Cooke City, Montana, and Sheridan, Wyoming in 2010. Our third author is award-winning journalist Gwen Florio. She's covered stories ranging from the shooting at Columbine High School and the Oklahoma City bombing trials, to the glitz of Miss America pageant, and the more practical Miss Navajo contest, whose participants slaughter and cook a sheep. And I think that's marvelous. She has reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia, as well as Lost Springs, Wyoming, population 3. She turned to fiction in 2013 with the publication of her first novel, Montana, which won the Pinkley Prize for debut crime fiction and a High Plains Book Award. 4 more novels in the Lola Wicks crime series followed. Her most recent book is Silent Hearts, a novel of Afghanistan, published in 2018 by Atria. Gwen is the executive editor of the Missoula local paper, The Missoulian. So, Rosella, if you would please.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? All right. I thought I'd begin by reading the introduction to my book. And as you can see, it's an art book. So it's a limited printing. And there's only 100 copies that have printed. When those sell, then I will print another 100 copies. And the first 100, I'm just giving you an intro, a little bit about an art book. The first, in this particular one, the first 100 is worth the most. So anybody that has the first printing in the long run will have the most valuable book. So this book is intentionally done with like quality in mind and limited access, but who knows? You know, just going from there. I'll show you one of my images here. So we'll start here. There is so much of Montana that doesn't meet the eye until you take the time to put wear on the tread of your soles. The medium of black and white photography transforms the color of the landscape. What remains are images that give a person the emotive quality of Montana at its core. Here you will find cold, very cold mountain lakes, hot springs and springs not so very warm. The images in this book hold the texture of the flora, grit of the sand, sculpted rock, and spraying falls. Between these book covers are meandering rivers, water lilies, misty mornings, and the change of seasons. Stories, facts, lists, haikus, and photographs are here to warm your heart as you join me on my adventures in Montana, mountains, and more. So that's the intro to my book, and what I decided to do would actually read 2 stories, 2 facts, 2 lists, and 2 haikus for you today. Starting, I thought I'd start with a word and put all the electronic devices aside, and the word is Crestamatic. Does anybody know what Crestamatic is, so you could share it with all of us? Crestamatic. It's spelled C-H-R-E-S-T-O M-A-T-H-I-C. And I learned this word in a book called Harry Callahan. Harry Callahan was a black and white photographer from Chicago, and he had a varied repertoire as far as his images. I was privileged to see his photography at the Art Institute in one of their exhibitions, and it was very beautiful. He's internationally well known. And the author began his book by having crestomatic as the word to introduce his photography. And what it means is useful learning. So I think in a lot of ways that's somewhat what my art book is about. It's useful learning. Like I'm tromping over the landscape with my camera, with a friend, a special friend, he's here. and there I am taking photographs, and what else can I think about? Well, I see the landscape, I see the insects, I see the mammals, and there's so much I don't know. It's really humbling, to me anyway, to walk over a landscape and realize how little I know. So this book is, in a lot of ways, fairly selfish because I got to learn things actually creating the book. On the other hand, I knew some of it before time, and then it was researching it and adding to what I knew already. But for me, it's really refreshing to know more about the landscape other than what I see visually. And in a lot of ways, that's what this book is about. So I'm going to start. I don't have any image software on this computer, so I'm doing it the old-fashioned way, one image at a time. And I'm going to read Tree Meets Sky. Well, it should be up there. Let's see. Okay. There is something iconic about a tree. There are the obvious components: a crown, roots, trunk, branches, twigs, foliage, bark, cambium, phloem, and xylem. The not-so-obvious characters are the strength, growth, and symbolism of time from seedling to the now of the tree, time past to time present. So the next reading is Krummholz. Krummholz is a German word. The word dissected helps me understand its meaning. Krumm means crooked, twisted, and bent. Holz conveys wood. It is the precise definition for some dense trees found braced for the elements in subalpine and alpine habitats. It is as if the weather itself took a large tree and placed it in a compactor. A tree whose trunk is often hidden in what remains is a beautiful, bristly exterior. Mountain goat hair is sometimes seen caught on Krummholz needles, or birds, rodents, and other animals are found darting in and out of the growth. Some trees in Montana growing as Krummholz are subalpine larch, Engelmann spruce, whitebark pine, limber pine, lodgepole pine, western white pine, alpine larch, and mountain hemlock. I used to always think that there was just one kind of Krummholz, and it was a whitebark pine, so that's part of the learning experience. So now I'm going to move on to the haiku. This is called Green Ash Draw. Relief to the plains, draws of green ash trees carry refuge from the sun. And the Missouri River, Brower's spring bubbled, Mississippi's mouth opened, dawn fosters sunsets. And now my list. This is an example of lists, so I'll read two of the lists. One is Beartooth Lake in the Beartooth Mountains. A lake is a lake. Well, certainly, and not exactly. Kettle, glacial, moraine, playas, temporary, underground, post-glacial, saline, fault, caldera, crater, freshwater, and mountain are all different types of lakes. Chokecherry is the next one, another list. Huckleberries tantalize those who savor fresh air, a unique flavor and an excursion to the wild side. Woods rose hips, prickly rose hips, bald hip, wild red raspberry, swamp currant, white stem goose, grouse whortle, dwarf huckleberry, common huckleberry, low huckleberry, snow, buffalo, thimble, bitter cherry, low bush cranberry, service, sticky currant, black elder, and chokecherry are all shrubs that produce edible berries. And I thought I'd end my reading with some stories, 2 stories. This is called Deep in a Fen. Oftentimes there were 23 of us that would sit in grandmother's living room. We would scrounge every chair in the house and garage. With them, we created a circle, then gathered adults and children to play Let's Go on a Bear Search. My heart beat like a wild horse by the time we got to the part where the bear was chasing us through a fen, and in unison our hands would clap our laps, then raise to clap the neighbor's hands. We would make suction sounds as if our boots were stuck in the heavy, wet, natural decay. A tree on the edge of the fen gave us an opportunity for escape. Up the branches we shinnied with the bear close on our tails. Scrambling down the other side, we were ready to bolt home the way we had come. As you can imagine, triple time was in order to outrun the brute. What a frenzy as 23 people scurried through the motions of our search in reverse. Safely home, what remained was a finale of gasping breaths and belly laughs. And then I thought I'd end with another creek. I spent an artist residency 3 years ago in the Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area. And one night it was just really amazing. It had been really hot and dry, and it started to rain. And this is what this story is about. It's called Another Creek. The night was still and the clouds settled in, one blanket layer over the other until the desert was warm. Gray layer after gray layer, the kind of warmth that comes with stillness, toasted the air. Gentle rain pattered the desert, one drop at a time, in a muted symphonic rhythm. The smell piqued my curiosity. I opened the door. The monumental change filtered through the screen. Enough. I could not get enough, so gathered my things for a walk. It was the desert itself pulling on a coat of rain. Sage and juniper, pure desert, nothing more, nothing less, filled the sand basking in the shower. The earth itself was silently humming.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If you would, please.
Sure. Yes, well, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks everybody involved in the Montana Book Festival for having me. It's a really nice opportunity. My presentation is not going to be about Montana as muse to myself, but more of Montana as muse to Ernest Hemingway. I suppose muse, he used Montana, or the ranch just outside of Montana, but the mountains surrounding, for 2 things. One, to actually do his writing when he was getting bogged down, suffering from writer's block, or it was getting too hot in Key West or maybe Cuba, he would head out west in order to finish a project. I mean, this formula started in 1928 when he visited Sheridan, Wyoming, and in Sheridan he was able to finish A Farewell to Arms, and he also met a French family named the Monsinis, who were bootleg winemakers, and then him and his wife spoke French, so it was an amicable arrangement. So he was able to finish one work, and he was also able to accrue an experience that became another work, The Wine of Wyoming. He followed this pattern up in 1930 when he came to the El Bartee just outside of Cooke City, and that year he finished Death in the Afternoon and sent that final draft off from the Cooke City General Store. And then, but also on that trip, as he was leaving Cooke City, he was driving in a car with John Dos Passos and Floyd Allington, who was a bootlegger from Red Lodge. Again, this was Prohibition, so there's lots of bootlegging going on. And they crashed their car outside of Laurel, and he was admitted into St. Vincent's Hospital in 1930 and stayed there for 7 weeks. And this hospital stay became the source material for The Gambler, the Nun, and the Radio, another short story. So again, he was able to finish Death in the Afternoon and also accrue an experience that would later become another story. He returned in 32 and finished the short story Light of the World at the ranch. And then in 1936, he returned to finish and wrote 350 pages of To Have and Have Not, and again sent it off from the Cooke City General Store. In 1938, he came back and he was working on his only ever play, The Fifth Column, and he was also rearranging all of his short stories that he'd published up until that time in a collection called The First 49 Stories. So he was able to do that in 38, and then he also crafted the preface to The First 49 Stories, in which he lists his 4 favorite places to write. And if memory serves, it goes something like this. Madrid was always a good place to write. So were Paris and Key West in the cool months, and the ranch outside of Cooke City, Montana. So in 1938, he basically establishes the ranch outside of Cooke City as his 4th favorite place to write. So, and then in 1939, he returns again, this time with For Whom the Bell Tolls, and he is down in the tropics trying to write about the snowstorm chapter of For Whom the Bell Tolls. And there's a great letter where he writes to his 2 sons, Patrick and Gregory, that, I'm sitting here in this prickly heat trying to write about a snowstorm, so I figured, what the what, citizens? Let's go out west and see a snowstorm. And this quote's really important because it shows that when he was struggling, he would head to this region as muse and as inspiration to cure writer's block. This part of his work then would pass off into his fiction and into his nonfiction. And it turns out that 3 of the major protagonists in Hemingway's fiction are all from Montana. Thomas Hudson of Islands in the Stream is a rancher from Montana, and he's biographical like all of Hemingway's characters, but 6 pages into the novel, he implores his friend Roger Davis, who is a writer with a drinking problem who is suffering from writer's block. Sound familiar, right? Like, implores him to go up to his ranch in Montana to solve that. So here you see like Hemingway's habit of doing that, then moving on to his fiction, where he would just put that into the characters. One of the other protagonists is Colonel Cantwell from across the river and into the trees. And the only clue we're given about his roots or upbringing is that he was in the Montana National Guard at age 16. And Across the River and Into the Trees is set in Italy. And so this colonel from Montana is going back to the site of his injury. And this is a fictional depiction of Hemingway's return to where he was injured in World War I, just outside of Venice. So Cantwell's from Montana, and his driver is from Wyoming. His name's Jackson, which is ironic, but he's supposedly from Rawlins, Wyoming. And if I can find it here, there's a great quote. And so as they're heading into Venice, they're starting to have a discussion about what is the toughest town in the world. And of course, the guy from Rawlins is saying, Rawlins, Gillette, all these places from Wyoming, and Cantwell, who is loosely based on Hemingway, suggests that it's either Venice, or after some disagreement, he goes on to say this: "Okay, Jackson, maybe we move in different circles, or maybe we have a differing definition of the world. But this town of Venice, with everybody being polite and having good manners, is as tough as Cooke City, Montana, on the day they have the old timers fish fry." So again, here you see him going back and using his experiences in Montana as muse. And Hemingway had attended the fish fry in 1932, and apparently there had been an incident where somebody had hit a woman with a poker, and the locals had tied that person to a truck and drug him around town. So this is why Hemingway considered Cooke City the toughest town in America, or in the world, actually. The most important contribution this region had through a character is through Robert Jordan of For Whom the Bell Tolls. And For Whom the Bell Tolls is Hemingway scholarship changes. It goes back and forth, but as of right now, I'd say it's probably the most revered of his novels. Sun Also Rises has kind of lost some of its pull, I think, and I would agree. I think it's his best book. And the protagonist, Robert Jordan, is from Red Lodge, Montana, and he is also he leaves Red Lodge kind of as a young man, and then attends the University of Montana and becomes a Spanish professor at the University of Montana. This puts him in a unique position to enter the Spanish Civil War because he has knowledge of guns from being from Montana and also speaks Spanish. And so the story of For Whom the Bell Tolls is this guy from Montana, a Spanish professor from U of M, heading out into the mountains of Spain to fight with the guerrillas and blow up a bridge for the war cause. As the story moves towards its climax, though, we start seeing how important this region was, because Robert Jordan, as he's trying to drum up the courage to blow up this bridge, and spoiler alert, I am going to ruin For Whom the Bell Tolls for some people here. As he's trying to drum up the courage to blow up the bridge, he looks back on a ride he took with Chub Weaver, who was Tom's father, from Red Lodge across the Beartooth to the ranch. And on this trip, he takes the gun his father used to kill himself. And Hemingway's father did indeed kill himself 1 year before he first came up to Montana and into the Yellowstone High Country. And he takes that gun and throws it into a lake. And then through my research and through conversations with Tom Weaver, the son of Chub Weaver, I found out that lake was For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is on the Montana side of the Beartooth Pass. And then as we go further on down the story, the climactic scene is him tying these explosives underneath the bridge. Think Guns of Navarone or Great Escape type thing. And he's under this bridge tying up the guns, and he turns and he looks down and sees a trout rise and take a fly from the river underneath him. And essentially the only trout fishing, fly fishing that Hemingway ever did took place between 1928 and 1939, and all in Montana and Wyoming. So again, he's leaning on his experiences and using Montana as muse to write this climactic part of the story. And then at the very end of For Whom the Bell Tolls, after they have blown the bridge and the band has gotten away and he's broken his leg, and he dragged himself up on the hill to try and shoot the pursuing Spanish rebels, the fascist rebels that are pursuing them. And as he's dying and he's fading out, his first instinct is to think of Montana. And that's what it says right there on the second to last page, think of Montana. And then we have the final line of the book. As he's lying there dying, it's he could feel his heart beat against the pine needle floor of the forest. And so those are there's also The Gambler, the Nun, and the Radio, which is set in the Billings Hospital. There's those three Montana protagonists, and then there's also his final short story, and this was the paper I presented in Paris, linking his final short story to Cooke City, Montana, which hadn't been done before. And the story is called A Man of the World, and it's a gruesome little story about a bar fight in a lawless town in the Montana mountains that ends with a guy being having his eyes gouged out, and then as he's writhing on the ground, he gets his genitals stomped, and the scream he emits causes him to lose his voice, and it's all very caricaturist violence, which is why it was sort of dismissed by critics. But if you look through all the Hemingway work, every story, especially the novels, involves some sort of tragic injury. So his earlier novels, Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms, deal with a guy with leg injuries or impotence, which is as a result of his accident in World War I. And then To Have and Have Not and For Whom the Bell Tolls also kind of depend on injury. And they kind of lean on his car wreck where he broke his arm, was in the hospital for 7 weeks. So this story, this gruesome little story with that resolution there, actually depicts Hemingway the way he saw, because it came out in 1957, actually depicts Hemingway the way he saw himself at the end of his life, which was essentially blind, voiceless, and impotent, which might give some indication as to why he wrapped it up a couple of years later. So I will leave it right there. On a happy note.
A cheerful tale.
Ernest Hemingway grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, which is where my mother grew up. And Ernest Hemingway went to the same Sunday school as my aunt did. So
Wow.
that's the other Montana connection.
Yep, crazy. It's like what we were talking about.
Gwen, you're up.
So I'm going to read a little bit from an essay I wrote for a book that's coming out, was supposed to be coming out the beginning of October. I think that may have been pushed back to November. I just got a note about it. It's called A Million Acres, Montana Writers Reflect on Land and Open Spaces. It's put out by the Land Reliance, benefits the Land Reliance, so when it does come out. And it has, as the title indicates, a number of essays and then also just gorgeous photographs of this place that we all love. And I start the essay by talking about how I became aware of Montana or this region. I grew up in Delaware, which is a state that would fit inside Missoula County. You know, it is tiny, tiny, it's very green. But I grew up on a wildlife refuge, and so although Delaware is pretty congested now, where I grew up is still wild and still open. And I pretty much ran wild as a kid until I had to go to school, which was just a miserable experience. And so coming here resonated with me in a lot of ways. But again, when I was a little girl, my dad, who's a wildlife biologist, went off on a project in Saskatchewan. He's also an amateur photographer, actually not just amateur, but brought back a lot of slides of the prairie. And these slides were things I couldn't imagine. There was so much space and so much sky, and I just fell in love with those images. I'm like, wow, you know, that looks great. And that was always in the back of my mind. And then many years later, someone pushed A River Runs Through It on me, and I was like, no interest in fly fishing, no, you know, but they said it's a really good book, you need to read it. And of course, once I started reading that, I started reading other Montana writers. Mind you, never having been here. So finally, one summer in Philadelphia, horrible, horrible, hot, miserable, humid, smelly Philly summer, I called my brother and I'm like, I gotta get out of here. Let's go to Montana. And I was really curious to see how I would react to this place that I had sort of had in my head, and I really wanted to go to the eastern part of the state and see prairie, but he convinced me to go to Glacier. And I will just kind of start it almost toward the end. Glacier was see your breath mornings in a campsite beside glacial green waters. Instead of the cacophony of insects, Delaware full of bugs, the wind soughing through lodgepole pines, new unfamiliar wildflowers, bear grass, Indian paintbrush, fireweed. No wolves or bears, a disappointment, but we did see marmots, mountain goats, and the promised loons. With each step up the mountain trails, I shed the city and something more, as that old sense of limitations fell away like the pebbles that dislodged under my feet and tumbled over the edge of a cliff, disappearing into oblivion. And one magical afternoon in August, I lifted my face toward the cool kiss of falling snow. Still, there was something about the pines crowding the trail, the mist that flowed like smoke off the slopes, the blurred sight lines, rendering spaces small, confined, unknowable. Glacier was a place of secrets, not a letdown, but it didn't evoke that childhood sense of compulsion. I have got to live there. I both expected and feared, which was a comfort, really. I could go back to Philadelphia with my itch scratched, widen my reading selection, and say the hell with writing. Sensible people didn't move to Montana and waste their time writing stories that would never be published. I could make another stab at being a grown-up. On our final day in Glacier, my brother suggested a side trip to Browning, the main town on the Blackfeet Reservation, and home to a well-guarded museum. We followed the Going to the Sun Road toward the park's eastern boundary, switchbacks leading us down and down from the Kodak vistas at Logan Pass. The zigzags lulled me into drowsiness. The fog swirled and parted, revealing trees like sentries hard by the road, then closed in again, enfolding us in a monochrome world. We took a final turn. The fog fled upward like a tablecloth snapped away with a flourish. The trees were gone. The horizon took a giant stride eastward. I rolled the window down. The wind rocketed past with the sound of ripping fabric, hurrying toward the vast spaces before us. The land suddenly sunlit, stretched forever, cut by features that did nothing to interrupt its headlong rush toward that unreachable horizon. Vocabulary I'd acquired long ago resurfaced. Coulees, buttes, sloughs. I could almost picture a white cardboard rim around the view with my father's precise hand labeling title, date, and location in the lower right-hand corner. But this was no slide. It was real, and I had to live there. The moose hide coat my father brought my mother from Saskatchewan hangs in my writing room in Missoula. When I hold it close, I can still smell the wood smoke all these years later. It took me nearly a decade after that first trip to Montana, and more than 4 decades after Dad first showed us those Canada slides, to finally move here. And when I did, it wasn't to the prairies. I lived first in Helena, the mining town turned capital, and then Missoula, where the surrounding forest sustained white settlement for a century, although by the time I arrived, the mills were giving way to tourism. On that long ago trip to Glacier, I rued not seeing a bear. Now black bears amble down our streets so frequently we risk complacency. Elk graze the slopes behind the house in winter, and coyotes help themselves to the neighborhood cats. The prairie lies 3 hours to the east, close enough for a quick day trip when the world closes in and I need a fix of sky and space and solitude. The solace of open spaces, Gretel Ehrlich calls it in her classic essay collection bearing that same title, a phrase that gets it exactly right. Once a year, I spend a treasured long weekend with writer friends on the Rocky Mountain front. To the west, the mountains stand watch, foreboding rock faces guarding the secrets of Glacier. To the east, the prairie rolls on and on. When I arrive, I find my balance against a wind seemingly determined to knock me off my feet, and take a moment to readjust my parameters in space that physically reduces me to a speck, but where my spirit expands and flies free. I break off a sprig of sage and roll it between my palms, then lift my hands to my face and inhale the scent. Home. Thank you.
One of the things that I have observed over the years is the people who were born and raised here have an experience of Montana that is appreciative in its own way, but the visitor who comes from somewhere else and experiences it, this was kind of evoked from what you were saying, Gwen, that there is something about Montana that as maybe an adult or a young adult has an impression. Can you speak to your experiences on that, whether you're a native or whether you come here and become an adopted son or daughter? So why don't we start with you, Rosella?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not a native, so, but I've been here for nearly 40 years. So it's hard for me to say, you know, what would be the difference between my experience in Montana or if I had been born here. I think it could have changed a little bit, but not a lot. And but that said, I find that anywhere, I think it's a personal experience, because anywhere I am, it depends on how I connect in the moment with that place. Montana, to me, is very special because it resonates with who I am and what I like to do, where another state might not do that, or someone else could have a whole different experience. That's the way I look at it.
Well, I was, my first 10 years were in Manchester, England in the 70s, and my next 10 years were in Los Angeles, California in the 80s. And so those are two pretty urban metropolises. And from California, I just kind of spread out, you know, tried to hit the deserts and hit the Sierras and Yosemite, and then worked my way up to Montana. And then by the time I found Cooke City, there was never going to be anywhere else, you know. I was just surrounded by a lot of population and a lot of city. And there was not just the beauty of Montana, and the activities that come with it, you know, whether it's catching fish and climbing mountains and all of that. But there was, not to be cliche, but there's a freedom, and that freedom is even more exaggerated in Cooke City. We have some people wouldn't see it as freedom, they would see it as confining, but there are no police, and there are no doctors, and no hospitals. And no high school, and it's 2 hours to the nearest stoplight. So it was just the polar opposite of how I had grown up, and then just the wildness and the ruggedness and like the extreme beauty is what drew me here. And I've since spread out in Montana too, throughout the different mountain ranges, and lived in Missoula for a little while, and I have friends in the Bitterroot and pretty much all of western Montana. But that's my story. I think it was more just a contrast to how I grew up.
And mine kind of conversely, as I said, was I felt almost as though I was returning to the way I grew up, but with a whole lot more space. I feel like I really need wild spaces to sustain me. There's something psychological about that. And the fact that I can walk out my door and be on trails in 5 minutes and just keep rolling is deeply important to me. But beyond that, my first job here, I was based in Denver, but working for a paper in Philadelphia, and had the whole West to cover, and I just kept coming back to Montana, and it involved a lot of driving all over the state, and it just knocked me over. And I hate to be cliched, but it was like falling in love. It was like the most massive crush you've ever had in your life that never went away. I mean, it is still a thrill. I still wake up in the morning and go, my God, I get to live here. So it just, I take it really personally. And I feel very fortunate.
I had a real similar experience. I was born and raised here, and left and went to live in New York. And after about 2.5 years, the voice inside was just, it was the crush. It was, my lover was back in Montana. I had to come back to this place, and I've never thought about anything since. Just because it's curious, which Montana author, not yourself, do you think captures the special muse of Montana in the writing that you're aware of, that you particularly like? Is there an author that you think has captured something about Montana that's especially intimate and accurate about Montana?
I would say I think Tom McGuane. Just because living in Cooke City, Cooke City is actually in the same county as Paradise Valley and Livingston and White Sulphur and all that. And along with like the beauty and the natural wonder and the danger and the adventure and all those wonderful things about Montana, it's the people. And that's something that Gwen and I were talking about just before we started. She mentioned that she knows people in Red Lodge who would talk to this guy who was son of like Hemingway's camp cook, and I was like, oh, Tom Weaver, my book is dedicated to him. He used to come up to Red. So there's this like intermingling of personalities, and I think McGuane captures that really well with some of his like super quirky books, like the Bushwhack Piano and Nothing But Blue Skies, about these kind of challenged misfits who try to make their way. Rancho Deluxe, you know what I mean? Like these really kind of strange, half hippie, half cowboy, emotionally challenged characters inhabiting Montana. So for me, it's McGuane.
Well, I would say Rick Bass, but there's a number of excellent Montana authors, so it's hard to name one.
That's why I asked that question.
Yeah.
Could I mention Ivan Doig?
You could. I'll open it up to the audience to ask the panel question in just a second.
And actually, however, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to mention 2 books that I think especially capture it, and one is This House of Sky, and the other is, Winterweed.
Yeah.
I love, and I think both of them capture how damn hard it is to live here if you do not have means.
Yes.
I mean, this place fights you, in a lot of ways. But it's also so beautiful, and you love it. And I think those books capture that, especially, I love Mildred Walker's book because it showed a beauty of a place that a lot of people don't think of as beautiful. But the people who live there appreciated it. So, but I mean, there are like tons and tons of books that adequately capture it, more than adequately.
Part of the festival objective is to allow you all to engage with the authors. And So is there anyone who has a question or a comment to any of the authors that we've heard today that you'd like to make?
Who was the author that you talked about, you in the middle, that you really thought captured with odd characters?
Tom McGuane?
McQuain?
Yeah, and he's kind of part of the Livingston Paradise Valley community of authors, along with Jim Harrison, and then another guy who contributed to my book, Dink Bruce, is part of that community. Russell Chatham was an artist who lived in Livingston. Richard Brodigan passed through there, you know, and so then when you start folding in like Hemingway's connection to Cooke City, Park County becomes this tiny small population county with this really prestigious literary history. So Thomas McGuane and a lot of these guys would also travel unrelated to Hemingway down to the Keys. There's like this combination. One, you have Yellowstone and the Everglades, so there's a relationship where people will work summers there and then go down to the Everglades for winters. And then there's also the fly fishing, like all the guides that fly fish the Yellowstone and Yellowstone National Park and the tributaries then have nothing to do in the winter, so they would travel. So like that artist community in Livingston kind of mimicked Hemingway's way of getting through the year, you know, 40 years before. But Thomas McGuane, and he's a little rough around the edges, but it's awesome.
And Jim Welch is another name on the show
Yes.
you mentioned.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
James Welch was a great author here. Any questions or comments? I mean, you don't have to have a question. If you have a comment, I'm sure the panel would like to hear your comments too. Okay, I'll go back to you guys. Anything more that you want to say about Montana as a muse? I was going to say at the earlier panel, James Lee Burke evoked Steinbeck talking about Montana's not a state, it's a love affair. That should be on our license plate.
There's another great Steinbeck quote that says, "Montana is what kids think Texas is when they hear Texans talk." So like, that's another cool Steinbeck on Montana for you. So I hope there's nobody from Texas in the room.
So there's one thing, I kind of fell into writing crime novels by accident, but then I had to write them. And this state is particularly useful that way. I think people think of crime novels as the mean streets of the big city. And I'm like, yeah, you holler in the city, somebody's going to hear you. You know, you're in trouble out here, you are on your own, and you got to figure it out. And for putting people in danger and like making things really scary, you know, just stick them out in the Missouri breaks or something. So it's a great landscape that way. The other thing that's really good is the weather. You know, so many things here will kill you.
Yeah.
It's kind of awesome. Errors will get you. You know.
Out of curiosity, have you read Cold Hearted River by Keith McCafferty from Bozeman?
Yeah.
So that is like a just transition from the crime work that you do.
Right.
And he writes these mysteries that are all named after a different fishing fly.
Yeah.
And the most recent one he wrote is called The Cold Hearted River. And it's a murder mystery. Cold Hearted River is a reference to the big Two-Hearted River of Hemingway. And I mentioned that all the fly fishing Hemingway really did was here between 1928 and 39. And part of the reason is when he traded the El Bartee Ranch for Sun Valley, all of his trout fishing gear and tackle, a big giant trunk of tackle, was lost on the railroad on the way to catch him. So he just didn't feel like starting over. And so McCafferty's murder mystery is based on this lost trunk of fishing gear. And so a lot of it takes place up in my region. And a guy named Michael Carita has just written 2 books that are based in Cooke City too.
His stuff is really good.
Those Who Wish Me Dead, which is now being turned into a movie with Angelina Jolie and
So I got to meet him at a conference, and I thanked him because he had a wildfire, I think, in one of his books, and I said, "You got it right."
Right.
A lot of people don't, but he did.
Yeah, he actually spends time in Cooke City, and he's those Who Wish Me Dead is set entirely in Cooke City.
Yeah.
Then he has another one about an electric lineman who goes, like you were talking about all the things, who goes out to fix these wilderness broken electric lines. But
Go out there.
and just in case we are running out of time, There is the 2020 International Hemingway Conference is coming to Montana and Wyoming next year, and I
Oh,
think
cool.
Michael Carita and Keith McCafferty and a lot of people will be
Okay.
involved in that. So if anybody wants to participate,
Will that be in Cooke City?
it's partially in Sheridan, Wyoming, and partially
Oh,
in
man.
Cooke City,
Two
Montana.
great places.
And but if you want to participate, you have to register for the conference and sign up and all that. Did you have a question?
My question was, I recently looked for writer residencies and retreats in Montana because I would really like to relocate here. I live in Sacramento, and I traveled a lot the last 10 years. It's really felt most like home. So, anyways, I couldn't find any. Do you
There's
guys-
an excellent one. There's an excellent one annually in the Flathead. So it's called Writers of the Flathead. And
Okay.
they bring in national writers. It's really well done. And it's been going on for years.
I don't mean like a conference. I
Right.
meant like a retreat or residency where writers can get.
Oh,
their
retreat or
work.
residency?
Yeah,
There
I don't think there used to be the artist residency over in Basin. In Wyoming, though, there are 3 that are really good.
I did find some in Wyoming.
Yeah, I've been to 2, so I,
It surprised me since Montana is so big,
yeah,
right?
it
Has
takes
these,
some
like,
money, I
artists.
know.
You can actually do the Bighorn National Recreation Area as a
Right.
writer as well. A lot of the artist residencies in the states also are open to writers. So if you were to check artist residencies, I think you could find.
Okay, good tip, right.
If you look up Alliance of Artist Communities,
Uh-huh.
it's a whole list of them around the country, and it
Okay.
has the deadlines. But I've been to Ucross and Brush Creek, and they were both just fabulous.
Cool, okay,
I mean,
thanks.
But it's
yeah.
my understanding Ucross now has been for the Native Americans.
They've got a special,
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, but it's, they're great. And there's a lot sort of in this region that are worth looking at that are pretty rural. So you'll get the same sense, it just
You
won't
mean
be,
the region,
like the general west.
Oh,
Yeah.
gotcha, okay.
Yeah, you could come to Cooke City, but you would have to like wait tables or 10 bar or clean rooms or something to, it would be that sort of residency.
And then I'd like to say more about Montana's music. From my perspective, this is a large state. I mean, it really became alive to me that it is the 4th largest state in the union, and it is so diverse. It is diverse both people, economically, every way you can think of, the landscape, the animals. It's very diverse. And I think that's part of the part of Montana that feeds me. What?
I had somebody once tell me that if you flattened Montana's mountains, we would be bigger than Texas. So we have 3 dimensions.
But then we'd be flat.
Yeah, that would be flat, right? Any other questions or comments? This has been great. Thank you to our panel. Thanks
Oh,
so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah,
that was great.
thank you.